Hello and welcome to HIST 141, U.S. History since 1877. My name is Derek Taylor. This is my lecture on post-World War II society in America, which I titled Great Expectations, Post-War Society 1945 to 1963, which is the era of the great post-war economic boom in American life and the baby boom. So very important for American history, especially if you're listening to this, your age, or the grandchildren of the boomers, I guess, mostly. So this is huge for understanding your world. And by the way, post-war boom, I tend to think of California. If looking at the image, the background from my slides is a picture of Los Angeles from mid-1950s, I think. California is one of the places that benefits actually as much as any from the post-war boom for a variety of reasons, which we'll show you in a second. So let's get started. A couple of things just to point out some points of emphasis here. We'll talk briefly about historiographical debates on post-war society, not too much, but a little bit. One of the big things I'm going to emphasize here is the effects of mobilization. Where we talked about the United States, home front was mobilized for World War II. This kind of continues because of the Cold War. I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of this in this lecture and emphasize this is a real thing and it has an effect. Thirdly, the role of the federal government in the post-war economy. It's very crucial for it. That's the upshot, as you'll see. And then finally, changes in family life and rising expectations on the part of the population, I think, are crucial for understanding the rest of our history, I think, after this. At least that's the argument I'm going to make here. We'll talk about in discussion. So there was a film came out in 1946, just after the war, World War II, called The Best Years of Our Lives. It's a wonderful film. You ought to see it. And it's about American soldiers coming back from World War II and having to readjust to civilian life. You kind of, again, if you're of a certain age, maybe you don't know this, but that used to be a common theme with the Vietnam War because we lost that war, but it was actually a problem for people coming back from the war. And one of the things about this post-war period is, again, you have this, and again, the war doesn't end because, of course, we go right into the Cold War. And so mobilization, and by mobilization, I don't mean people are giving, they're being drafted and putting guns in their hands, although that will happen too, eventually. It's that public, in terms of its, if you like, consciousness has to be raised for the sake of fighting the Cold War. And all the post-war booms, the economic boom, the baby boom, they're intimately related to this mobilization of the country for the Cold War. So much of this was done by the government itself, but not just done by the government itself, I should say, but by willing participation by businesses, individuals, churches, and the like. And what I think the reason I'm emphasizing this is because a tradition of American voluntarism disappears. People do things voluntarily in terms of, associations. At least a certain part of it does. It doesn't totally, but it becomes tied to the government in ways I don't think it ever had before. Partly because of this blurring of public and private I talked about last time. This is Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. Again, this sense of we're all in to get this together as in a momentous crisis that is, part of a war, right? Everybody rallies around the flag. Everybody puts aside their differences during war. The United States government, to fight the Cold War, does tend to think self-consciously they have to do this. And remember now, the Cold War is not, when I say Cold War, it's not a shooting war. What is it a war then? It's a war between two ways of life. Between a materialistic consumer society that, supposedly puts individual desires before the collective equality. That's the Americans. And then the Soviet one, the Russian one, that promises equality and security for everybody, allegedly. And so this means that during the 1950s and 60s, things we regarded as private, our family lives and religious beliefs, our business ventures, our educational systems, other things, they become enlisted in this public, public campaign to fight communism. Again, not in a literal sense, but in a sort of in an intellectual sense. You can overdo this, by the way. Again, our private associations or like the family churches has always had some part in public life. But the big difference here in the 1950s is the immediacy and the urgency with which this is sort of projected to people, and how it intrudes upon the entire population at once. You can't avoid this stuff. This is most obviously and spectacularly true with, say, the McCarthy hearings. But the general atmosphere of, tension about nuclear war made people aware, maybe for the first time, I don't know, a lot of people thought about this stuff, but that the world could end at any moment. So it heightened people's consciousness of these things. Maybe more directly, one of the causes of this mobilization in life in the 1950s is big business. If you remember, during World War II, it had become a public partner of the government for means of war production. And what's going to happen after the war is that a lot of the same companies that produced war goods for the war will go right into producing consumer goods. And in many cases, directed by the exact same business. People like Henry J. Kaiser would work with FDR during the war. And so it sort of feeds into this. And this post-war boom has to be said is built partly on the desire for more stuff, right? It's a consumer-driven boom. GIs coming back from the war, remember, grew up during the Great Depression. So they never lived in anything but, for example, in terms of housing, anything but small apartments and cramped houses because of the Depression. So when you have these big corporations churning out these cheaper, larger, more spacious, if perhaps aesthetically less pleasing homes in the post-war period, they jumped on them. Things that were not available to people before the war, like television, radio, other creature comforts, all of a sudden become available to people, partly because of the sort of production capacities of this public-private partnership between government and big businesses. So we become even more, we always were in a way, a consumer nation. What's so bad about that, right? This gets us into the historical debates. Because there's an ongoing debate. This gets into public. You probably have heard some of this stuff into our public conversations about the 1950s, right? Some people think it's the best of times. Other people think it was worst of times. In some ways, this debate is really dumb, I must say. I think partly because I say because I don't think the debate is really about the 50s. It's about what happens after the 50s, and people are kind of looking for the origins of the divisions in our society that have opened up since the 1960s, and they kind of look at this decade, and depending on your stance on the issue, and the contemporary debates among historians that I'm talking about, which generally speaking, one side is more conservative politically, philosophically, thinks that 1950s America was in some ways the peak of our civilization. The economy grew as never before, increasing comfort and convenience made lives easier for the middle class families, even working class families in a way never happened before. Overall, the wealth the nation was accumulating was spread more evenly than it ever had been before. That's the sort of one side of that debate, the pro side. And there's some evidence to support this. On the other hand, more liberal, mostly liberal historians and commentators have noticed that many of the particulars that drove the post-war boom, the rise in birth rates, decrease in the age of marriage, decline of number of single people, the prevalence of the one breadwinner household, these are all made possible by a unique and pretty much unrepeatable set of circumstances following World War II, when America was the absolute dominant economic power in the world, because the rest of the world's economies who were advanced got flattened by the war. So, and again, I'm not coming down either side of this debate. It doesn't matter. I just want you to know what the debate is, whether they have it. My take on all this about the 50s and about post-war society, it goes something like this, which is that these debates about the 50s, they're not about, things like, they're not about the 50s. They're about us today. Like take the example of family life. You've probably seen it in films. You've heard it on the news that the 1950s with this, two-parent household, nuclear family, that sort of thing, is an idealization. It's all these other things. It's usually sort of criticized or poo-poo or something like this. And of course, the other side of that debate says the 1950s had the perfect family life and all this little stuff like that. I'm exaggerating for effect. All of this obscures deeper divides, not about what the 50s were actually like, but okay, what's the nature of the family? One can agree that certain features of it were exaggerated in the 1950s, but still believe that the ideal is the nuclear family. It's about ideals and not necessarily about historical changes. And this is all caused, I think, by something that did happen in post-war society, which is, I think, it changed things in terms of people's expectations. To me, I titled this Great Expectations. I stole this, by the way, that title from a title of a very good book on the post-war era by a guy named James Patterson. I think all this economic growth that took place did something. It was so widespread, it made people much more aware than they had been before that not everyone was benefiting from it equally. And I come back to this idea of, going back to FDR, if you recall his New Deal, and his aspiration to, quote, build a country in which no one was left out. It must have become much more noticeable in post-war society under constant mobilization for the sake of fighting communism, in defense of a consumer culture, in which a large minority is still not allowed, for example, to sit in the same areas as other citizens, or face the same kind of violent discrimination in the South that Afro-Americans did. It made these things more noticeable. And there were other tensions almost certainly that leaked beneath the surface, concerns about women wanting to enter the workplace, the stifling of political speech, those sorts of things. But it leads to a sense among everybody of expectations rising. And then, of course, when your expectations get higher, there's always the threat they won't get met. And I think what's going to happen after the 50s, begins in the 50s, is that the discontents of many of the people who had benefited most from this post-war boom, the sons and daughters of the upper middle classes, chafing under the conformity of Cold War life. That's another thing that gets criticized about the 1950s. It's true enough. I think what's going to happen is those sons and daughters will become those baby boomer radicals in the 60s, who sort of in their own minds merge their discontents with the much more serious issue of inequality for Black Americans in the 1960s. And I think that's what's going to cause the break that comes later on. But all this is implicit in the 1950s. That's why we still debate this stuff. But I do think, to quote James Patterson here, that this post-war boom did create greater and greater expectations that the United States would be able to, in his words, quote, create a better world abroad and a happier society at home, unquote. And when it doesn't in the 1960s, that's when things begin to sort of break apart, if you like, in certain ways. Whether those expectations, by the way, were ever really realistic is a totally another matter. Hint, I don't think they were. Anyway, coming to this time period itself, here, by the way, I have on the lecture slides for you, you can actually access and listen to the little Bert the Turtle video, or part of it, from the Cold War. I put that in there just so you can hear it. Just to give you an idea, when I'm talking about mobilization, this is what I mean. Stuff like this, training school kids to be aware of nuclear war, is a form of mobilization. I'm not going to play it here because my computer won't pick it up, but you should play it. It's worth a listen, and it's kind of funny. So what about that economic dominance I mentioned earlier? Well, it has basically several underpinnings. The first one is that the United States at the end of the war is just the greatest behemoth the world's ever seen. By the late 1940s, America possessed 7% of the world's population and 42% of its overall wealth. This translated into two things: influence at home, but also enormous influence abroad. America began helping to create international institutions, which they effectively dominated. I think this is 1949. I don't have the date here, my notes for some reason, but there's a meeting at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, which established the US dollar as the capitalist world's principal reserve currency. and also led to the creation of two of these major institutions. One, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The World Bank provided private loans for the reconstruction of war-torn Europe, as well as for the development of third world or developing countries. And the IMF was designed to stabilize the value of currencies, helping to guide the economy after the war. Again, when I say guide the currencies, what all this is aimed toward is preventing global economic catastrophes like the Depression, which of course led to World War II. A second major pillar, one of the biggest ones, is defense spending. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower identified in his 1961 farewell address had its roots in those business-government partnerships of the Second World War. But unlike after World War I, the massive commitment of federal money for defense continued after 1945, as indeed has continued ever since. As this permanent mobilization I've talked about took hold, science, industry, and the federal government became increasingly intertwined. According to the National Science Foundation, federal money in this era underwrote 90% of the cost of the research on aviation and space exploration, 65% of that on electricity and electronics, things like computers, by the way, 42% of that on scientific instruments, and 24% of that on automobiles. Yeah, it's a private economy, but it's being funded increasingly by public dollars. And again, this is partly in response to the Soviets. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, sent their first satellite up into orbit. The United States immediately begins to focus on the space race. Eisenhower first, and then Kennedy later on, funnels millions of dollars into new college scholarships and university research in science and technology, again, to keep up with the Soviets. And by the early 1960s, around 1 in 7 Americans owed his or her job to the military-industrial complex. And this goes along, by the way, with a more general atmosphere of an increased faith in science and medicine as a result of things like, the development of a polio vaccine and just the general, our victory in World War II led to a lot of faith in technology and science. The other major part of this post-war boom is big business, which gets really big. The consolidation of economic power into the hands of big firms continues. And to staff their bureaucracies, the post-war corporate giants required a huge white-collar army. And a new generation of corporate managers emerges, an environment which they demand things like long-range forecasting. According to the head of the Chamber of Commerce in the 1950s, they were entering, quote, a period of accelerating bigness in all aspects of American life, unquote. Bureaucracy gets really big, both in business and in government, right? And they're intertwined increasingly. The sociologist David Reisman wrote a book called A Lonely Crowd in 1950, which contrasted this new managerial class with the older ideal, the independent businessmen and professionals. And basically criticizing them, saying these new corporate men were other-directed, quote unquote, in his terms. That is, they were more attuned to their associates than driven by their own goals. So you could say this is part of a criticism of post-war conformity. Nonetheless, it led to big gains for basically everybody, not equally, but everybody. From 1947 to 1975, worker productivity more than doubled across the whole of the economy. Eventually, as industries mechanized and began to outsource jobs, that would begin to that would really affect the manufacturing sector. That had to come basically after 1970. Before this, America's annual GDP, its gross domestic product, jumped from $213 billion a year in 1945 to more than $500 billion in 1960. By 1970, it exceeded $1 trillion. This led to a sustained growth of 25% rise in real income for most Americans between 1946 and 1959. But again, as I mentioned before, this also led to people noticing where this didn't happen. So you get to get books written in the latter part of the 1950s or 60s. 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith writes a book called The Affluent Society, in which he starts talking about the poor as being an afterthought, being invisible in the minds of politicians. A few years later, 1962, Michael Harrington, I believe there's an excerpt from his book, The Other America, on poverty in America. People are beginning to notice it because amidst all of the sort of, we're all into this together rhetoric of the Cold War, we notice more readily perhaps when people are being left behind. And you can see this rise in GDP reflected by this graph. It's pretty striking, going up, bottoming out during the first years of the Great Depression, zooming up increasingly, hitting its peak in 1970. You also see here, this is the great age. This is, I don't know how it's the first age, but it's definitely the first age of a supermarket like this. Everybody crammed into lines. The good old grocery store. I'm not sure what year this was taken, early 1960s, but it's kind of odd, isn't it? You take a look at this, how little this has changed in the last 60 years, because this is still what they look like, more or less. And here's the picture from a book called The Organization Man, Dan Weiner. Again, one of these books criticizing, again, the conformity of our business class, which you can kind of see. Everybody's wearing the same suit, the same tie, the same hats. There's a couple of ladies there. But that's kind of what this idea of criticism of getting a big business and big corporations, and definitely big governments. Things get much more bloated and bureaucratic. Another aspect of this is that consumerism has sort of merged with the Cold War. People are sort of encouraged to spend as a sort of almost, it's a patriotic thing. And this has lots of things that feed into it. Partly because people want more things. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But it does get a boost, by the way, from the federal government, the GI Bill, which sent people, for example, to school who had never attended college. On, again, government financing was a big part of this, which led, by the way, to a ballooning in the 1950s and 60s of the educational system. People, especially in the 1960s, the baby boomers will go to college in far greater numbers than any other generation has in human history. And this will be a big generation. This will actually create a generational divide between them and their parents. But it also leads to big benefits for the educational system, monetarily speaking. There were criticisms. People like T.S. Eliot, I think, mentioned this in the 1960s, but the benefits, a much better trained workforce, increasing standards of living, all during the Cold War buildup, drowned out all this. And so student enrollment balloons because of the GI Bill and other things in the 1950s and 60s. At the same time, this consumerist drive benefits blue-collar workers, even though you have collective bargaining becoming the normal means for determining how labor will be rewarded. For example, the United Auto Workers go on a big strike, but get more or less shut down by General Motors, who nevertheless turns around and lays out a very generous terms for a durable relationship. It accepted the United Auto Workers Union as a bargaining partner and guaranteed GM workers an ever higher living standard. On the other hand, the UAW basically backed off on trying to attack company management. And what it does is this is basically the golden age of the working classes. In the 1950s, it's hard to imagine now. You were someone who worked with your hands, who only had a high school diploma. You could go into a company like Ford or General Motors, something like this, and get a good job with good benefits, send your kid to college, and with good pension and all this stuff. And so they basically backed down in return for what was a great deal. But as a lot of people have pointed out, the thing that made this possible, the fact that these car companies, for example, they're only one example, could offer such good terms, good pay, all those other things, was due to sheltered markets. Sheltered markets mean they didn't have competition from Western Europe because it was still recovering from the Second World War. Once all that came to an end, once by the end of the 1960s, you start to have serious economic competition from West Germany and Japan. This is going to spell the doom for all this. But at the time, it was, again, a great boon to the working classes. Increased educational levels, growing home ownership, higher wages, all enabled Americans to consume more than they ever had as well. And patterns of consumption that were created in the 1950s would endure for decades. Houses, cars, children, television, This is one of the biggest things. Maybe you still do this at home, like the nightly, watch TV together as a family. We used to do that when I was a kid. We stopped doing that when I got to be a teenager, but that was kind of a thing. There were only, and this is a swift, by the way, rise to prominence of TV, which it's losing, of course, because you watch everything on streaming on your computers and your phones now. But hard to think of it in my lifetime. Like TV is no longer as important as it used to be. But in 1947, there were only 7,000 television sets in American homes, but by and only one network showing regular programming. By the next year, both CBS and NBC radio networks started to do offer regular programming. And by 1950, 3 years, Americans owned 7.3 million television sets. In 3 years, from 7,000 to 7 million. That's how fast it happened. 10 years later, 1960, 87% of American homes had at least one television set. And again, that's hugely important because now you can broadcast, images to people of what life should be like on television shows. And you'll get this criticism from your textbook about the ideal family, Leave It to Beaver, stuff like that. But that's why it became so dominant, because of this overnight sort of triumph of television as the medium people got their news and information from. Here, just demonstrating, by the way, the peak of labor in the 1950s. Again, its success came out of the Second World War as well. You see the spike during the early part of the First World War. Slight dip when it ends, goes back up. 1950 goes down, comes back up again, but it declines since the late 1970s, been off a cliff. But it's, again, labor and the working class's golden age was in the post-war era. And of course, here you have an advertisement for TV. You can see that there, all the stuff they're advertising. Look how big that TV is, by the way. Look at how humongous that thing is. That's another thing you probably don't know about is big tube televisions you have to lug around when you move. Oh God, those things were horrible. I can't believe I've turned to my father and I'm saying you guys have things so easy, but it really was. It really stunk. But look at how they're advertising, right? To mom, if you can read this, it says, it means beauty for her home with fashion award cabinet designs and entertainment all day long. It means relaxation after work, his favorites to dad, his favorite sports, news, variety shows, low-cost fun at home. To the kids, it means a new world of magic and fun-filled education with 2 simple controls. Even your dumb kids can operate this. To the older folks, it means a home of hours of happiness without leaving home. You don't have to do it anymore. You don't have to think anymore. You can just watch the TV. It's pretty brazen, the way they advertise this, but you get the idea. I guess we do the same things with phones, but it is funny. And that's March 17th, 1951. If you can't read the date up there. Amazing. One other thing happens in the 1950s is the rise of the Bobos. Is the Bobo, the term coined by a writer named David Brooks. It means people who live in the suburbs, bohemian types, bohemian suburban types, whatever. It means, the rise of people who live in suburbia, middle-class suburban types. And that's one of the big things that happens. People flee the cities, particularly white Americans, leave older cities in the North and Midwest for newer ones in the South and the West. And there's a major demographic shift from the city to the suburbs. Both of these are stimulated by the dramatic growth of car ownership, but also the federal government's support of housing and highway initiatives. By 1960, 1/3 of Americans lived in suburbs, and because few new buildings had been built during the Depression, the country faced a housing shortage. By 1960, the nation had added 25% of new housing stock since 1950. And one of the ways this happened was people began applying mass production techniques to home construction that had been pioneered during the war. In particular, a man named Arthur Levitt, again, one of these businessmen who made out during the war. They built housing subdivisions all over the country that sort of spurred this, switch from the city to the suburbs and from rural areas as well. And when you get these subdivisions, which you've probably lived in some of them, I have, their names are actually revealing in some ways. places like Quail Meadows, Silver Woods, Meadowbrook, places like this, which are kind of indicative of some sort of, vicarious nostalgia for a real life nobody ever actually lived. But it's interesting to get those names. The thing I point out about this is that a lot of these homes were financed by mortgages with the federal government from the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration rates for veterans at rates dramatically lower than those offered by private lenders, again, demonstrating the way the federal government was entering into and influencing daily life in new ways. There were other things that divided people in terms of housing, however. A lot of these new suburban homes, as well as their funding, were reserved for whites mostly. Again, a lot of homeowners had to, in places in the 1940s and 50s, had to sign restrictive covenants, keeping people out of the developed housing developments. People like Blacks, Asians, Jews. These, by the way, were declared illegal by the Supreme Court in the 1940s, but they went on anyway until the civil rights laws in the 1960s banned them entirely. Just to give you an idea, there used to be, these covenants used to exist. To give you an example from a local area, in Lawrence, Kansas, in the area around the university, if you go there, they used to have covenants, keeping out, among other things, Jews and Catholics. I know this because someone informed me there's a Catholic center near the campus, KU in Lawrence, and someone who goes there told me that the neighbors never, like, there's still like tension. Some of the neighbors don't like it being there. The thing was built in like 1987, but again, this gives you this idea of like legally keeping people out of homes. Again, it only ended like a half century ago or 60 years ago. So that's part of this as well. And this is just a little sketch for a planned community in Park Forest, Illinois, 1946. You gotta see what it looks like. It looks kind of futuristic for the time, actually. And they got a Sears right there with, gotta have a Sears and Roebuck, gotta have shopping, right? You've seen places like this in the and other places, you know what it looks like. And here are the infamous Levittown, or one of them, from the San Fernando Valley in California. Kind of like house farms gets criticized. But again, if you came from a poor family during the Depression, this looked like paradise to you. Especially, by the way, if you're living in Southern California. Again, it doesn't look like much there, but let me tell you, Southern California has the best weather on earth. So you move to a place like this, if you grew up in like, Minnesota or someplace like that, and you move there back after the war, again, this is your dream in many ways. And finally, of course, when you move away from cities, you move away from centrally located restaurants, you get in the 1940s, the invention of fast food, dine-in, stuff like this, diners, and then later on, of course, McDonald's I guess I don't know if it's McDonald's alone, but they invent fast food, of course. So all part of that suburban growth. And where do they go mostly is the Sun Belt. As I said, the South and the West. This was, again, spurred by the federal government. The National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1956 funded the building of a massive set of highways. This led to the growth of cities, also led to air pollution and massive traffic jams. The pollution's gone, traffic jams are still there, obviously. And so this will help, by the way, precipitate the decay of downtown areas and cities. And again, southern and western states get most of this growth. Several things are there. Land's inexpensive, labor is not organized as well in those states, taxes are low, and the climates, again, are warm, and it's not cold. And the state that grows the most in this period is California, accounting for 1/10 of the nation's population by 1970, surpassing New York as the most populous state. However, one more distinctive feature of the Sun Belt suburbanization is its very close relationship with the military-industrial complex. Military bases proliferate in the South and the Southwest in the post-war decades, especially in my home state of Florida, but also Texas and California. That's, by the way, not not merely, that's not an accident. You also have higher rates of volunteering for the military in those states, but it does them to benefit them as well. And you can see here, again, main US highways, 1930s. See how few highways we have. There are no highways almost in the South at all, none in the West. In 40 years, look at how much of the country is connected by that. Massive shift. Very useful map. Like maps like that, very useful. And here you have shifting population patterns. The red spaces with the dark around them are how much are places that grow the most. They're all in the South and the West. LA more than anything else, but San Francisco, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Atlanta. And then, of course, my hometown of Tampa, and then Miami. Major population shifts. The biggest ones are not even in California, but Nevada, New Mexico, or Arizona, and of course, Florida. And of course, this flight sort of leads, again, by the early 1960s to noticeable divisions. Now, I mentioned earlier you had the Federal Housing Administration getting into this, and as you're going to see, they're responsible for some of the problems that go on. Between 1950 and 1960, the nation's 12 largest cities lost 3.6 million white Americans and gained 4.5 million non-white Americans. Why does this matter? Because when the whites left, tax revenues left. And it led to the decay of services, infrastructure, racial fears, fear of crime on a racial basis, led to this white flight. And in particular, one big problem in the inner cities was housing. Urban renewal produced grim high-rise housing projects that destroyed communities, destroyed their bonds, created in large, anonymous, open areas that made, good areas for crime. And one thing to mention about it, and you can read about this and see this on documentaries, look for it in other places. This was largely subsidized by the federal government. In the 1940s, Federal Housing Administration screened out people who applied for federal housing loans on the basis of potential risks, mostly being Blacks or Jews or ethnic minorities. So they helped create this demographic, and they built these awful looking buildings. Even someone like Harold Ickes, who had been FDR's very liberal Interior Secretary of the Interior, served in Harry Truman's administration. He only approved public housing in areas that were already predominantly Black, refusing to countenance building for African Americans in areas that were mostly white. So this is, in other words, what leads to the idea of the ghetto, which are mostly African American. It's partly due, there's other things involved, but again, the federal government, trying to, if you like, social engineer things, makes things worse. And these post-war cities just become, it's kind of hard to imagine because all this has changed before your lifetime, but they've been gentrified in the last 30 years. A lot of downtowns of big cities, definitely Kansas City. Like, it was not like this 20 years ago at all, if you know anything about it. But they became places for the poor to sort of hang out. I don't mean hang out, I mean unemployed, there'd be racial hostilities. Basically, you have two Americas emerging, one suburban, the other urban. This contrast, again, this opens up a contrast that becomes very noticeable. And that'll spawn a lot of demands for social change in the 1960s. At the same time, you're going to begin to have in the post-war period, this will definitely accelerate in the 1960s, but you're going to have immigration changing the nature of the country as well. Several acts were passed during the war. The War Brides Act, the Displaced Persons Act. They repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act during the war, helped create an influx of immigrants to the American cities. The federal government especially welcomed Mexican labor into the country during World War II, which was revived in a program, was revived in the 1950s, only ended in the mid-1960s. Residents of Puerto Rico have been citizens since 1917, so they were not subject to immigration laws, which, by the way, this is totally off topic, but a lot of Puerto Ricans, well, to this day, want statehood And in the 1950s, there was a group, a nationalist group called the FALN, which was pushing for statehood for Puerto Ricans. One of their members went into Congress in the middle of the 1950s and shot it up. Took a rifle in there, shot it up. Didn't hit anybody, thankfully. Later on, that group would carry out bombings in the 1970s. I'm not mentioning this anyway, but like it gets sort of written out of history. It's weird. They were a big time terrorist group for like 20 or 30 years. Anyway, but they're an immigrant group. Beginning in the 1960s, fleeing Castro's Cuba, Cubans come in large numbers to places like Miami. They turned it into a very cosmopolitan, almost Latin American city overnight. And so you begin to have, again, changing demographics affect the nation very noticeably by the end of this period. There's an example of one of these cities. I have no idea which one it is, presumably from the 1950s or 60s. These are the housing projects which we were talking about. One other thing that needs to be mentioned here, I think it's important, is religion in post-war America. There is, in fact, a post-war religious revival in the United States, and actually even to a much lesser extent in Europe as well, briefly in the 1950s. Perhaps because of the Cold War. Actually, it is partly because of the Cold War, but for all reasons, Americans reaffirmed their faith in the 1950s. Church membership jumped from 49% of the population in 1940, half to 70% in the 1960s. In particular, evangelical Protestant denominations flourished and will flourish again in the 1970s. New preachers make their mark on the post-war landscape, most notably the late Billy Graham, who made use of television, radio, and advertising to spread the gospel, gave massive rallies, which he called crusades, in stadiums all over the world. And so this is kind of not a new thing in American history. It's happened before, but happens in this context. And I should mention, just to be clear, Americans had always gone to church in larger numbers than in similar Western industrialized countries like in Europe, as they do to this day, though it's been an obvious decline since then. But there's a change in the quality of this religion. It becomes more civil in several respects. Even though it had a sort of evangelical bent to it, it's more moderate in tone. There is an ecumenical movement among Catholics, Protestants, but also Jews, which flourishes in the 1950s. It also means that there's a definite concern for the here and now. One of the things that unites all these groups is, to see in a moment, is anti-communism. They're all firmly anti-communists. And this was noted at the time. Was a man named Will Herberg published a book in 1955 which captured this mood. It's called Protestant Catholic Jew. And it basically proclaimed the idea that in America, ethnic loyalties were weakening, but what he called a triple melting pot consisting of those three religious identities was still significant, but more as brand names or badges of identity rather than a sets of beliefs. He suggested that increasing harmony between these three faiths, was done at the expense of authenticity by watering down dogmatic and religious demands, creating, as he put it, quote, religiousness without religion, or religion without a whole lot of content, mostly about being sociable or belonging rather than sort of being oriented toward a serious commitment. And so you have, again, those blurring of lines that I mentioned because of the mobilization, because it is definitely, again, there are other things going on here. The final, and this is, by the way, an era in which, if I didn't point this out, Catholics are being increasingly accepted into public life. John Kennedy will be elected president in 1960. But part of this is that religion is being mobilized for the purpose of fighting communism, both voluntarily by the churches themselves. They don't need too much effort to do. You see this, by the way, reflected in popular culture. Hollywood produced a number of sword and sandal films. You've ever heard that phrase, with religious themes that seem to encapsulate a conflict between a free society and a tyrannical one. Think of the old Ten Commandments film. There are a bunch of other ones in the 1950s. There's a film made a few years ago by the Coen brothers called Hail Caesar. It's set in the 1950s, and it's about this producer who's Catholic, who's making this film about Jesus. And in order to make the film, he has to go and get he wants to get approval from all these different like members of these different religious denominations, like Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Jew. There's a scene in the movie, you ought to go watch it. It's pretty good, where they're arguing about what should be in the film and everything. That actually happened. I mean, like Ben-Hur, like the movie Ben-Hur, if you've ever seen it, they actually did. They reached out to different religious groups to see what they liked. That was a real thing. That's part of that what happened. It is also definitely about communism, by the way. The United States, for example, like you had all denominations becoming more and more embracing of things like religious freedom. This is partly a Cold War thing. The United States government abroad promoted religious freedom in communist countries as a way of undermining the Soviets. And people, there were members of these religious organizations who would occasionally do work for them, like the CIA and stuff like this actually happened. So part and parcel of the era. You know, you have an image of Billy Graham, what stadium that's from. That's where I think it's probably the 50s, it could be the 40s. Him in high dudgeon, raising it, his hands raised. The probably the preeminent evangelist of his era. And here we have to mention Fulton Sheen. Fulton Sheen, as you can see, is a Catholic priest, became a bishop later on, but he was popular priest of New York City. And during the night, I think it's like 1951, 1955, he had a television show called Life is Worth Living, where he would get to talk about moral topics, stuff like this. And for 4 years, I think for like, well, it was more than that, but I think for like several years in the 1950s, this was the #1 show on television. This Catholic priest wearing like a big cross around his neck in these robes. I had a colleague at the University of Kansas who, he's passed away since, but he told me, he sort of mentioned this just almost off topic one day in class. I used to love watching that show when I was a kid. He had this cape and he'd throw it around. And he was a very dramatic speaker. Fulton Sheen, if you've ever listened to him talk, like he's Irish, so he has this good Irish voice, and he could go from being, very, Mormon, being very dramatic and all this stuff. But part of his popularity, by the way, just to come back to this, is that he was a really, really ardent anti-communist. So again, that blurring of lines coming together as a result of Cold War mobilization and eloquent preachers. And finally, family life. Got to get to family life, because this is the era of the baby boom. The boomers. This is one of the most noticeable aspects of the age. A couple of things about this is that one, there's not a real big rise in the divorce rate until the 1960s. And of course, married couples are more intent on having children. After a century and a half of decline, the birth rates went up for the first time in a long, long time, between 1948 and 1953. Partly because of optimism. This happens, by the way, in pretty much every era in history we are aware of. When people think times are good, they start having more kids. The younger generation, and this applied to people who didn't fight in the war. Not just war veterans, but people with younger generation, because they were optimistic about the future, economically speaking. Even Black women, who were mostly poor at that point, had higher birth rates in this period, much higher than, in fact, than their white counterparts. And all this, of course, would fuel, the economy. Families bought food, diapers, toys, clothing. Nation's educational system would get a massive boost as the new middle class, going to being the first majority college-educated generation, would, lead to a lot more money being spent on it. Also leads to the growth of, family experts, Dr. Spock. He wrote a best-selling book in 1946 called Baby and Child Care, that sort of thing. As if we needed more experts. But again, this is some of the things it feeds into. Also has an effect on work in the family and the work of women. Baby boomers came from a generation that emphasized the care of the mother in the home while expecting men to be breadwinners. And one of the things that makes this possible, of course, is that people are making so much money, you can actually do this. Nonetheless, you do have women beginning to enter the workforce after the war for a variety of different reasons. By 1954, married women made up half of all women workers. By 1960, the number of mothers who worked had increased 4 times. So they're working more and more, actually. In that year, 1960, 30% of wives worked outside the home, and by 1970, it was 40%. And so you have women working more. Why? Because they can. They can make more money for the family. They help lift families. If you're working class and you have some money, but your wife works too, all of a sudden, guess what? You're middle class. That leads to mobility. So there's a issue there. I say this even as you have people beginning to criticize at the end of this period. And you'll see this from Betty Friedan in your major problems reader. What Betty Friedan calls the feminine mystique. This is the idea that women are ideally suited at home, that their only value and only commitment is to be a mother in home, and also other stuff. There's going to be some criticism about this. And this is partly because this ideal of domesticity that people have, woman in the home working, doing the chores and the man working, it doesn't reflect reality, partly. It's also because things are changing in some ways for the worse, which is weird, for mothers as mothers. In fact, with the growth of that sort of ideal of nuclear family in the 1950s, mothers at home were doing more domestic work than ever before. Why? Well, because in the 19th century, middle-class women had servants to do most of the work. That's all gone for social reasons now. But now you have time-saving appliances like refrigerators and washing machines, which meant that women did even more work at home. So mothers had it worse in some ways, if you can imagine, because of all this wonderful progress that has been made. And so there's also that. There's also, as we'll get to in a second, other reasons they might have some discontents. Although, again, this is one of these people debate. I'm not saying it's an absolute truth. There are signs of it, though, at the end of this period. And here you have images of the middle-class family ideal. Out for a picnic there. I don't know what year that's from, but I'm assuming it's the year 50s or the 60s. And just to make this clear, by the way, again, sometimes this is portrayed as being a white ideal. It's not. You see the image of a black family there, building their home, presumably out in the suburbs, with their 2.1 children. Again, this is not. Again, people shared the same ideals in the 60s. They just weren't. They were not equal in terms of their fulfillment. That's what leads to problems, which leads to people having different ideals later, obviously. So. Come along, changed a lot since then, obviously. And here you can kind of see, again, women at work. Again, this is women as a secretary here. I'm assuming this lady is also, I don't know have no idea what branch of work this is. But because they're answering phone, I maybe presume they're secretaries. It's another thing, of course. Women probably want more advancement at that point. Again, possible sources of discontent. And then finally, of course, this is just an image of the birth rate, right? It's been, not the stable, but you can see how it dips during the Depression. Again, people don't have kids when things are bad, and how it spikes as things get good. And then, of course, tails off again as later on, obviously, as all Western industrialized nations have done. Finally, one thing we have to discuss here, because it gets discussed back then a little more, despite its reputation as being a really conservative era, is sex. Your text, and again, this is a debate, like how sexually conservative was the 1950s. The public expectation was men and women were supposed to channel their sexual activity to marriage. That would remain the sort of public ideal. At the same time, however, this is also the era of who after founding Playboy. There's also a flourishing sort of underground of, there are, homosexual communities in cities. They're all different places beneath the surface, right? There's also something called the Kinsey reports that were published in the 1940s and 50s, which allegedly at the time was supposed to reveal a broader range of sexual behaviors among average American people than had previously been thought. Things like homosexuality in these reports were proclaimed to be much more prevalent than in fact they were. And all this will lay groundwork for the sexual evolution in the 1960s. However, those reports, by the way, they're based on surveys, right? This is the era of the first social surveys. Those studies were very flawed. They were criticized at the time um, because they most of the subjects of the polling were prostitutes or people who had been charged with sexual crimes, and it relied totally on self-reporting, just their say so. Again, this is not really a scientific survey here. However, it does show the influence of things like polling in this period and purported, authority of sociology, because this did influence people's ideas, even if it was based on shoddy research. So that's part of this as well. One other thing that might have happened, by the way, to have this undercurrent of sexual libertinism in this publicly conservative era is the sort of militarization of society itself. One possible interpretation of the possible growth of, whatever you want to call it, sexual activity, is World War II itself. The idea goes that because so many men went overseas during the war and afterwards, they, military, I hate to break it to you, but military life opens up opportunities for sex for men. And because so many men during the war engaged in prostitution in the war, then got married, or got married before the war or after, under pressure perhaps to marry women that they'd gotten pregnant, combined with the increase in social and physical mobility during the war, led to a loosening of sexual mores. That's the sort of theory. Even as people were embracing a comfortable middle class ideal. I have no idea if that's true or not. Just to give you one anecdotal piece of evidence for it, one person who did do a stint in the army during the war from 1944 to 1946 was, in fact, Hugh Hefner. He wrote for a military newspaper for 2 years, I think in Korea, if I'm not mistaken. So possible. It's possible. And remember, it's probably significant after this war, unlike World War I, there was no military drawdown, and so young men probably continued to have access to recreational sex in ways they might otherwise not have. And so the argument goes, the kids born in these homes got a hold of the things like the pill later on. They rebelled against what they thought was their parents' hypocrisy in the 1950s. Again, I don't know if you can generalize that, but I think there's something to that, because again, war does do that in certain regards. But because of the sort of mobilization for the whole society and everything like that, we got put under the rug. Probably, again, yeah, possible. I do not say that's absolutely true or anything like that. And finally, one other thing happens in the 1950s, there's the family life, which is the invention of youth culture, which you should definitely see as a subject of consumer culture. You know this, by the way. At your age, there are companies out there who are targeting you, who want to take your money from you, to buy their crappy products. This has its beginnings really in the 1950s. This had begun in the 1920s because of the lengthening of years of education. Kids spend longer time in school, but also their increasing purchasing power, such that for the first time, companies begin targeting people in that age range because they know those families have excess income. They give them to their kids. They target them with advertising and stuff like this. And of course, because of all of these sort of, public emphasis on conformity, kids hate this stuff, right? So you have a new market emerging, which, advertisers, filmmakers exploit through films and books. A bunch of them, Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean, 1955, books like J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, published in 1951, which is about teenage rebellion. What really sort of catches this rebellion against conformity is, of course, music. This is the birth, of course, of rock and roll music in the 1950s, which is a huge change in and of itself. Again, as late as the 1940s, there was no distinct genre of quote-unquote teenage music. Before this, kids mostly listened to largely the same stuff as their parents. What happens, of course, again, music makers figure out, hey, kids have money now. So they combined things like blues, country, and other elements with rhythms and beats, which of course, and this is actually true, suggest sex. That's what rock and roll is about, basically, in many ways, in order to, again, get their money from them. And no, I'm not making that up. Pop music is an invention of that fact. And that's why, by the way, of course, parents reacted so badly to it. White adults especially saw rock and roll music as an invitation to things like sexual promiscuity, to juvenile delinquency, but also to racial mixing, right? Because this was essentially, it's not totally, there's some other stuff in it, but black music. So you have people like Elvis Presley, right? Who's the most famous person by far, entertainer maybe in the world at that point, comes an embodiment of this. Why? Because he sings and dances on stage like an African American. So all these things cause worries. And of course, the kids love that because you have to stick it to their parents like teenagers like to do. So it becomes a vehicle for this. And so this gets codified because of that. I cannot stress, by the way, I'm not making this up, how much it is just companies doing this. It's not some natural thing that emerges. It's very much a result of all of the things we've been talking about here, patterns of education and spending and so on and so forth. And of course, the kids wanting to rebel against the conformity at the time. And so you will get, by the end of this period, along with the invention of pop music, which again, you think about that, that's an important milestone, by the way, in human history. No culture in human history had invented an entire genre of music just to appeal to people in their teens. And it's important because, and you have no way of realizing this yourself, it's the music that everybody listens to. Music that's designed for teenagers is the public music of the entire country. Think about what that means. You know, I'm gonna digress here just because I think it's important. When I went to graduate school, I had this idea that I needed to listen to different, I listened to pop music right when I was a kid. Big Beatles fan, actually. Yes, I'm old. I was born long after the Beatles. But I thought I had to learn to listen to classical music. That's what my colleagues would listen to. And so I basically, on my own, started listening to classical music and learned to. Partly this is for social reasons. You want to impress people, but I got where I love this stuff. It's beautiful music, and I learned more about music and all this stuff. When I got into graduate school, started working, I came to realize that almost all of my colleagues were boomers, none of whom listened to classical music. They just listened to the pop music of their youth. Think about what that says. Like, you're permanently stuck in your teenage years with the music that influences you. That's very strange. Anyway, you get that happening. At the same time, you have trends in literature and other arts where you have writers like and poets like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who are so-called beat poets, who become critics of middle-class conformity, you know, capitalism, materialism, all this other stuff. You begin to have this idea of rebellion becoming not just marketable, but beginning to have a generational influence because of, this is the last thing I'll mention here, the size of the baby boom generation. There's a reason why we talk about them as a generational cohort. They were so big. Why is that important? Because that means there's a big number of people who all were born at roughly the same time, who share the same taste in things like music, who go into all the institutions in our society at the same time, which means they will have a dominance over over society just because of their numbers, which they will exert almost from the very beginning as soon as they become able to in the 1960s. And so that's our lecture on the post-war society, Great Expectations. You can see how they were raised. Next time we'll get to the things, the tensions that are all beneath the surface here, brought to the surface by those great expectations which are not met, and which leads to a splintering of our society, which really has existed ever since in the 1960s. So thank you for listening. Hope it helped you guys. I will see you in discussion. Take care, and see you next time.